it's like a danger to think like, oh, the young people will take care of it. So often you hear like, oh gosh, young people are more engaged around the climate than older generations are they're more invested and the young climate influencers, for example, that I've interviewed or talked to, and my own students. I mean, that feels like a real cop out to them, of like, oh, just they'll take care of it, because they can't by themselves.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. It's easy for a lot of us to think that climate change won't affect us that much. Thinking that way might be temporarily comforting and convenient, but whether we want to admit it or not, we are all experiencing the effects of the climate crisis and the environmental crisis that humans have created on this planet. It's just a question of how much we're aware of these effects and what we're doing or not doing to try to prevent the worst potential impacts of these crises. If you talk with people in their late teens or early 20s, a lot of them are acutely aware of these crises that we're facing. People in that age range are dealing with all of the normal big questions and decisions that young adults face. Decisions about careers, starting a family, dealing with all of the adult responsibilities that they might or might not feel fully prepared to face. Now, today, they're having to deal with all these issues while also confronting a very uncertain future and even bigger questions like, what is living on this planet even going to be like in 10 or 20 years? Mallory McDuff is a professor who teaches environmental education at Warren Wilson College near Asheville, North Carolina. She's going to be our guest today. She is the author of several books that focus on climate change and the environment, including Love Your Mother, 50 States, 50 Stories, and 50 Women United for Climate Justice, and Our Last Best Act, Planning for the End of Our Lives to Protect the People and Places We Love. In addition to publishing 20 articles in academic journals, Mallory has published more than 50 essays, which have been featured in publications including The New York Times, The Washington Post, Wired, BuzzFeed, The Huffington Post, and Sojourners. For over 20 years, Mallory has been living on campus at Warren Wilson College. For Mallory, living and teaching at the college and raising two daughters has given her some unique opportunities to connect with young adults, to understand their thoughts and feelings about climate change and the environment, and to see how those thoughts and feelings have evolved and continue to evolve. In this episode, we'll talk with Mallory about those experiences. She'll also describe how she became interested in environmental education. She'll talk about some of the unique environmental education and community engagement programs at Warren Wilson College. And she'll share some advice for educators or future educators who might want to follow in her footsteps and do the kind of work that she's been doing. So Mallory, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
I would love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about how you started doing the work that you're doing today, like a little bit about your background and your story of how you became interested in environmental issues and environmental education.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a small town called Fairhope, Alabama, on the Gulf Coast of Alabama, which a lot of people in my life, like as a young adult, I'm not a young adult now, but when I was a young adult, a lot of people didn't even know that Alabama had a coastline, until the oil spill, that the BP oil spill put Alabama's coastline on the map years ago. But I grew up in this town, with proximity to water in a family that integrated their faith, lifelong Episcopalians, with environmental stewardship and conservation. And so that's really, I had this family that we spent a ton of time outdoors. I'm the oldest of four kids. And basically, my parents thought that going to Sunday school really meant, exploring the estuary of Mobile Bay, going on bike rides together. And we just spent a lot of time outdoors. And for them, that was actually connected to their faith, which was something that I didn't really reflect on much, until I was older and realized, oh, wow, that was something they did without like proselytizing or making it be this big deal. But, we had practices together as a family, like giving up trash for the 40 days of Lent. Um, so it was a unique, and now I can realize it was a unique way to grow up.
When you say giving up trash, what does that mean?
Well, we gave up trash for Lent. This was before recycling. Basically, for 40 days, as a family of six, we didn't generate any trash. And I was in high school at the time. I didn't have anything to do with it. It was really, honestly, my parents who really thought about, their shopping patterns and what we could do to basically not generate any trash. So it kind of seems crazy now. I generate so much my family of three now, but it was just a practice for 40 days, and it wasn't like they were thinking that practice was going to change the world, but it was more for us just to reflect on what we were purchasing and how we could reduce the amount of waste out of one home.
Do you know how your parents became interested in this? Because there are a lot of Episcopalians, probably a lot of people who take their faith very seriously, but aren't that interested in environmental issues. And do you know how your parents developed that interest?
I do actually. My dad attributes his interest in the outdoors to the Boy Scouts. Um, they both grew up in Mississippi, in Hattiesburg, and Columbus, Mississippi, respectively. And he really does say that, or he did say rather that the Boy Scouts was what got him into doing camping, doing things outside. And for my mom, she got into it through church camps. Her father was an Episcopal priest, and he ran and started actually the Episcopal church camp in Mississippi. So they weren't like these hippies, they were, my mom like played bridge, and she taught preschool, and my dad worked for IBM and sold computers, but they saw this as a very big part of our lives as a family. And they went on, I mean, they died, basically when they were around my age. I'm 58. So they were in their late 50s and early 60s. But, subsequently they ended up like hiking the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Coast Trail, and almost all the Continental Divide Trail, when they were in their 50s, which um, again became a part of their spiritual life. Just they used to talk about hiking as a form of meditation. So I was lucky to have these role models.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's interesting how, I hear this from other people too, how just more of a general interest in outdoor activities leads people to, a greater appreciation for the environment. Like when you love being outdoors, it's seems kind of hard to not notice how beautiful it is out there and want to protect that.
Right, definitely.
I was reading an article or some of your information online, and it says that you discovered the field of environmental education as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Central African Republic. So it sounds like you had this general interest from your family in the environment and the outdoors, and then you became more specifically interested in environmental education. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I didn't. It's funny because I teach at a small college, at Warren Wilson College now, and and I have two daughters. One is 20, almost, well, 25, and 18. And so much of a young person's headspace, I think, is often taken up with like, what am I going to do? To make a living, to find meaningful work, and that's a big question, right? And to support themselves. And I didn't even know that the field of environmental education was a thing when I was in college, but I did. If a few years after college, I did go to the Peace Corps, and in Central African Republic, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has the lowest level of light pollution of any country in the entire world, and that's not because it's because there's not electricity, in much of the country. And I was there for for 3.5 years. And, it was a wonderful experience and a sobering experience, and really one of the most transformative experiences in terms of shifting my perspective. I taught science for 2 years, in a classroom without windows. I mean, there were windows, but there were an open air classroom. Kids didn't have textbooks. Um, there might be 50 students in a classroom, and this country has undergone enormous conflict and enormous pressure from colonial forces in terms of extraction of their resources. But my last year, I worked with the World Wildlife Fund in a nature protected area where there were elephants and all kinds of wildlife, and it was just really an interesting place to be, to see that, like, this megafauna, this elephants, which for me were like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. Look at this elephant. That they would often come and trash people's fields, and at some point were like considered very large vermin. Um, and so that was, as a young person, that to me was when you see something so stark and you see, wait, this is like one situation, and you can have very, very different lenses on it. And that really got me interested in how do we evaluate the impacts of conservation programs, of environmental education programs specifically. And so then I ultimately went to graduate school to try to help programs that were doing environmental education do evaluation of their programs, but from like a participatory angle, so involving all the stakeholders, from staff to funders but not just being an external evaluation. So I got really interested in that, and then ended up going to Kenya to work with the wildlife clubs of Kenya there to do a participatory evaluation with them of their programs.
When we talk about environmental education, there are like multiple aspects of that. There would be like the work you do now on a college campus teaching environmental education classes to college students. But it sounds like what you're talking about, some of your earlier work involved doing environmental education in places like Africa, where there are these animals that need to be protected if we want to see them survive. And there's a need to educate the local community about the importance of those animals because, yeah, sometimes they are just seen as pests or, dangers. So is that what you're talking about? Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, yeah, I wasn't really educating them about, I mean, my role was to collaborate with the staff who were doing environmental education to help them document the impacts of their programs. So in this case, for example, in Central African Republic, they were at the time trying to build ecotourism. So that really wasn't my role to say, oh, these animals are really important, but rather I was working with local partners to design programs so that when we were actually designing programs for school kids, and then they were trying to build ecotourism. And the unfortunate reality in CAR, Central African Republic, is just the um, the impact of war and violence and extraction on that country is at the time. I wasn't able to go back because of that, and so the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya actually invited me to come and not to design their programs for them, but to work with their staff. So mainly helping them document what's the impact of the programs they're doing. So, in Kenya, they were basically doing programs for school kids, so that they could even go and visit the national parks in Kenya. Because at the time, it was like, oh, all the tourists are getting to see these animals, but local kids didn't have access. And the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya basically granted free access to the parks, but that doesn't do anything unless you have transportation. So then they were trying to provide transportation so kids would go and see the animals in the parks. So I don't know if that gives you a little more context.
It does, yeah. And I think that's an aspect of this kind of work that people don't always think about is the importance of documenting the impact or documenting the effectiveness because we can see pictures or videos of a bunch of school kids going and visiting, a wildlife park and seeing animals for the first time, and it looks great. But the people who are going to provide funding and transportation and resources want to see more detailed documentation than that of the impact. Is that kind of what you're talking about in terms of the work you were doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And just ensuring that folks on the ground had some say in developing those evaluations, and some tools, so that they could do it and not just rely on external donors saying, "Oh, you're doing a good job," or "You're not."
Yeah.
So it was a long time ago, but it definitely, I'm a mom of a 25-year-old who's actually my oldest daughter is in the Peace Corps now. And it's a very different situation. She's in Costa Rica teaching English at an elementary school. Very, very different situation. But I think these experiences where you're living in a different culture, whether you're in the U.S. and just exposed to a different culture within your own country, or whether you're able um, to travel and experience other cultures. These for me it was very formative.
So if we move ahead to now, to present day,
Now I have gray hair. I didn't
we're
then.
gonna we're going to skip ahead a couple of years. So you live on campus at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina. You teach there. And you were talking a little bit about just your experiences living on campus and being around a lot of 18 to 20-year-olds who care about environmental issues. And just just some observations you've made about that, or just how that experience has affected you. So that'd be really interesting to talk about. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. And I'd say my students in terms of age, it's probably 18 to 25 is or 24 is like the bulk of students. And then we also have, what are called non-traditional students, who are much older. I have them spending time this weekend with a student who's, turning 60. But for the most part, I teach and live at Warren Wilson College, which is right outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And I've lived on campus for 24 years, which is crazy when I tell students that, because that is older than most of them, more years than they've been alive. I've been living on campus in a 900 square foot little duplex, and with a view of the campus farm. And it's just an exquisite location. But it's a tiny little house, and I think for me I think about the question, what is it like to grow old around young people, both at home and at work, and particularly like what does it mean to grow older around young people who are acutely tuned in to like the climate crisis, to the intersecting crises that are, unfolding, in the world. And, for me, I guess it's like I often will wake up like with a sense of dread, and it's not necessarily about the world. Like maybe it's about something going on with my kid, or, something that, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do about this deadline, or, and, getting up and whether exercising first thing in the morning and then being around students, my job is to not deny like the feelings of whatever anxiety about the world, but I feel like my job is to like have some presence with them, so that I can, I don't know, just be present, whether it's in the classroom or in a field trip, but that I'm mirroring back to them, you have a place in this world and your work matters. And what we do together matters even more. Individually, what our work is won't have as much of an impact, obviously, if we're not building this collective momentum. And so, I think it kind of calls me to like get out of my own head, which is, um, and that's a good thing, right? For all of us, so I think what does that mean for others? Like I think there is power in getting out of our heads and being around people that are different age, different demographic than us.
I've often thought in the past that younger people, you might think at first thought might be that they have so much more at stake because, like, okay, I'm in my 50s and I'm not going to be around as long as they are probably. But really, when you think about it more carefully, like I do have a lot at stake. I'm going to be growing old over the next 30 to 40 years, assuming I, stay around that long. Even if you're thinking, well, I've got a great retirement fund and I've saved for retirement and I can take care of myself. The truth is, we're all very dependent on each other and this world that we live in for our health and safety. I mean, we all have to eat. We're all dependent on the community around us. And so it was interesting when you said you were talking about the work that we can do together, because I think the more I think about this, the more I realize that it is really important that we all have so much at stake. I mean, yes, younger people are starting out in life and they're going to be doing a lot of things that someone my age has already done. We've already had those experiences. We've already built that foundation, whereas they're just starting out in that. But what you were mentioning about, how much we all have at stake together and how much more we can accomplish together and how important that is probably a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Oh, I think totally. And a lot of like, to me, I think that it's like a danger to think like, oh, the young people will take care of it. So often you hear like, oh gosh, young people are, more engaged around the climate than, older generations are, they're more invested and the young climate influencers, for example, that I've interviewed or talked to, and my own students, I mean, that feels like a real cop out to them, of like, oh, just they'll take care of it, because they can't by themselves, and I think that, 10 years ago or so, we might have thought like, oh, it actually won't impact me, let's say me, 58-year-old. And now it's like, oh, shoot, like this is happening now. I walked into my classroom yesterday and, it was 70 degrees outside and the daffodils are all blooming. And we're all like, okay, this is like, it's really beautiful. And it's really weird that all of February has been so warm and we've, had these, warm as, I mean, we're now in March, but this reality, this knowing like things aren't as they should be, and and facing that together and leveraging the resources that different generations have, voting being one of them, is so important. I often think about Bill McKibben, who has been writing about climate change for decades, and he started last year, 2 years ago maybe, a group called Third Act, and it's for people over 60 to galvanize and organize them in climate advocacy and divestment. And, it's been very successful because he's, realized, okay, there's this whole group of people who want to make a difference, but just needed, a framework and a structure to be able to enter into. So that's an interesting group, Third Act. And of course, you can, follow their work and whatnot, on social media. But it's also a great place. It's all over the country, and it's a great place for folks who are older to be able to contribute to the movement in a way that feels right to them. So, yeah, I do think it takes us all, and I think that, for me, like just as a person, being around students, I mean, it's not just about like, I don't know, responding to the climate crisis, but also just things like learning from them, about what's on their minds, whether it's no matter what it is, whether it's saying, some kind of funny saying that I try out and I'm like saying it totally wrong, like or like in trying to engage in, food justice work, something more substantive. So, I mean, I think for me, I kind of find some like quirky delight in like being the old person now, which I, don't really see myself as. I mean, 58 is not that old, but I'm one of the older, teachers now. And I've been at this school for so long that I still don't see myself as the older teacher, but that's what I am. And so there's some delight in, yeah, and getting to learn together, with my students.
You mentioned being present and, listening and learning, which seems really important. I'm interested in what you think or what your ideas are about the ways that, let's say, older people, I'll say older person like myself, what can we do to support younger people who are interested in these environmental issues, who care about these environmental issues? You're talking about, which is what you're talking about, I think is really useful, just being present and listening, because that seems to be a common complaint among younger people, is that older people, I think a lot of younger people feel that older people don't care or aren't listening. And so just showing that you're willing to listen and learn and then, allow them to be heard is probably a really important thing.
Like I'm a single mom with two daughters, and my 18-year-old might say I'm not a good listener. I think wanting to do that at home and trying to do that as a parent too is probably even a bigger charge. So that's kind of a sidebar, but for me, it's the same skill set, right? But it's a little bit different complexity of dynamics when you live in the same house and you're trying to work towards similar household goals.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it makes sense that, it is a bigger challenge when it's your own family, your own kids.
I mean, probably more important too.
Yeah, probably an opportunity there to have an even bigger impact, yeah, than as a teacher. What else do you think, as someone who's really involved in this area, what else can, I'm just going to, it's the same question. What else can older people my age do to support younger people who are interested in environmental issues?
Well, I think one thing with thinking about climate writ large, I think people tend to think like, oh, this is like, impacts the environment. But the interesting thing with climate is it's so intersectional that, you may have the young person who's really interested in health issues. And, that is definitely a way to engage with climate. We know that air pollution, for example, has, catastrophic health impacts. So I think, I mean, the easiest place to start is like if there are young people in your life, like what you were saying, just asking them, what matters to you. I asked my students, I got these questions from Britt Ray, who wrote a book called Generation Dread. And it's about, the younger generation coming up. And the basically generation dread, the dread of like from climate anxiety to, all the other things that this generation is facing. And I got these two questions from a lecture that she did, and I used it with one of my classes this week. And the two questions were, one, what gives you joy at being alive? Or what makes you happy to be alive, essentially? And so I asked them that question, and this was on the first day of class, and they were writing, they just kept writing, and then they shared with a partner. And then the second question, again, that I adapted from Britt Ray's lecture was, what breaks your heart in the world? And one of my students, this was the first day of class of a class on death, dying, and climate justice that's based on or inspired by my book, Our Last Best Act. But so this was the first day of class just this week. And one of the students like joked like, oh, you're really, starting out heavy on day one. And, but it was so interesting to me, those two questions, they're so big, right? Like what makes you happy to be alive and what breaks your heart? And just watching them respond so eagerly to those questions, it made me think that those asking people those questions is an important thing, like because we can get so fixated on like, oh my God, like everything that's so wrong. And I think for older people to, even if without asking the question, to tune into in a young person's life, what is bringing them joy, what animates them, and being curious about that, as well as what feels like it's heartbreaking, and being curious about that. So that's more in terms of conversation, and paying attention and presence. And, in terms of practical matters, I think just getting involved with any group, from for me, it's like the communication is a big thing we can do. So talking to other people, or even communicating online. And then collaborating is the second thing we can do, not sitting at home if we have, if we have the means to be engaged in community, not just online, like joining with others in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be big. And then three, doing that, in community. Like those three C's to me are ways that we can support young people and support our whatever generation you're a part of as well. So that's, going from like broad questions that for me like elicited a lot of response to just the practical aspect of acting with others. I'll just say as an example, this is not with my students, but with my 18-year-old. She was volunteering just I don't know, a few weeks ago with at this nonprofit called Bounty and Soul in our area, and they basically have a free farmers market where they're giving away food, to anybody. Anybody can come. And so she had recruited, I don't know, 15 of her friends, and she realized, oh my gosh, we need an adult. So I mean, the organization asked them to have an adult. So she called me at the last minute, and I was able to come and join them. And, the role I played was like minimal. I was basically it wasn't like I was doing much, but watching the high schoolers just feel so out of their heads, like they were out of their heads. They weren't on their screens. They were engaged in their community, and then realizing that I was there with them, that was intergenerational action, even though it seems really small. So yeah, I think not to underestimate the power of small acts of collaboration, communication, especially in community.
Yeah, there are three, seems like really important things that you're mentioning there, especially when it comes to climate issues and conservation. There's so much bad news. And if we're, reading the news, paying any attention at all, there's just so much terrifying news out there. And so staying connected with what brings us joy, what can motivate us to act rather than feeling paralyzed, by remembering, the things that we enjoy about life, the reasons why we want to, protect our planet and the way it is, and the life on it. But also that part of what breaks your heart, because it is really important to keep that motivation that comes from just being aware of how serious the problem is, and that we really don't have time to, kick the can down the road. There are urgent issues. We are in the middle of a crisis. So it seems like it's really important to keep like one foot in both of those. I'm not sure where I'm going with this metaphor. One foot in both of those worlds, in order and maintain a balanced view in order to be able to actually take action. Seems very important.
So I wrote this book called Love Your Mother: 50 States, 50 Stories, 50 Women United for Climate Justice. And in that book, I wrote profiles of the stories of 50 women, and they come from a wide diversity of ages, vocations, racial and ethnic backgrounds, and one story for every state. So, and the book starts and ends with my own lens, on women and climate. And it was just an honor to get to write about each of these women. one of the women, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who represented New York, she's got a new book coming out in the fall that's called "What If We Get It Right?" And it's visions of climate futures. And she's a oceanographer and climate advocate, and has done amazing work. But I love that question, like, what if we get it right? And then she, outlines these visions of climate futures. The book comes out in the fall, but it's available for pre-order. So Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson developed these three intersecting Venn diagrams, and she gave a TED talk on it about 2 years ago. And I think I've used it with my students, and I think it's a great way to think about, like, what's the thing that I can do. So she looks at, in one diagram, one circle, you rate, what are the skills that I have, skills and talents that I have. And another, it's what brings me joy. And then in the third, it's, what does the world need right now? And so, for example, like, I'm a good organizer, but I don't actually love, like, running committees. But I love using my organizational skills maybe to, plan events. So what brings you joy? What are the skills that you have, and what does the world need right now? And I think, it's important to realize that we can't do everything, and that doing things with other people, I've seen with students and with my children, as I was sharing with the example, that's a way where we feel less alone. And, in a weird way, I think like, feeling lonely and scared, which is really normal, that can be like the biggest detriment or obstacle to collective action. And even just small things, like the example of just showing up for a food market, which seems so small, but I just saw my high school daughter and her friends feel so animated by that. And one, they also were, off, like I said, they were off their screens. They were in person, in community. So getting up and doing something with other people, is super important. I think it's also, I think it can feel so overwhelming, and we can feel like, oh my gosh, what should I be doing? We know that 100 companies globally contribute 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's also important that we aren't paralyzed by thinking, oh my God, I've generated so much recycling, and I know recycling we don't even know how effective it is. And, I think that paralysis is exactly probably what fossil fuel companies would love for us to continue to be feeling, but feeling momentum and power in community with other people is, to me, I think, the antidote to that.
So you've been living on a college campus for over 20 years, engaging with college students for over 20 years. In that time, what are some of the differences you've seen in their attitudes towards environmental issues or awareness of environmental issues?
Warren Wilson, as a college, tends to attract students who are engaged around environmental issues. Environmental studies is our most popular major. We're a very small college in terms of demographics, under 750 students, but 1,000-acre campus. So there's a farm, there's a garden, there's a extensive forest, and students work on campus in jobs, from being a gardener, in the college garden, to working in the cafeteria, to working in IT. So in terms of what change I've seen over two decades, I guess I have to think about it. I think there's more anxiety now, and that's also not just me. I mean, that's been documented in terms of young people rates of anxiety, and so that's, that, I think that's the one I would say. It's not like 20 plus years ago people weren't anxious, but I think, over the time that I've been teaching, I've also, seen our access to information about all of the intersecting crises, which can be a good thing, but it can also be, as you said, really paralyzing. So, it's funny to think about. I don't really tell the students this because I'm not trying to like berate them. But, 25 years ago, I would walk into a classroom and people wouldn't all be on their phones, including me. So, it's interesting to have taught over the time that cell phones and smartphones became so ubiquitous in our lives. Not that that's causing the anxiousness, but it's definitely, I think I used to not even have, internet at home. And now I can't imagine that.
Yeah, it's such had such an impact on all of our lives. And I know it's difficult and maybe not in any way useful to, in some cases, to try to describe like, college students in general and tendencies among college students in general, or even like talk about all college students on a single campus as if they're a homogenous group. But do you have any sense of, if you had to describe like the overall outlook that college students have, at least the ones that you encounter, their overall outlook and view of the future, does it tend to be positive? Is there like that sense of what if we get it right? Or does it tend towards more anxious and concerned and pessimistic?
I think it depends on the hour. I'm laughing, but I'm not really joking. I think that and again, it's just my perspective. Like you said, I can't, I have 3 classes a semester. And my advisees, those are the students that I come in contact with. I think they're holding both at the same time. And that's kind of how I feel like I am. I'm got this sense of like, oh my God, the dramatic weather events, the flooding, the drought, the like, how is this, my 18-year-old wants to go to college in the fall and she's excited and, nervous and wants to study psychology. And, it's like part of me is wonders like what's, going to be her future, her reality. With my students, I feel like they're holding the anxiousness, and then they're very committed to wanting to do something with their life that feels like it's making a difference. And for all of us, maybe that is like the way through. We can't be like toxic positivity Pollyannas, on anything. But so maybe holding the anxiousness with the commitment to finding, a meaningful path through, that may be the most realistic way. So that's what I see right now. If I think about just even my classes last week, we had a class period where we're talking about like how do you help to figure out where you're going, just in terms of like an internship or your job after college, and they're committed to finding meaningful work in an uncertain climate of not just the climate, but it's an uncertain times. That's hard holding both though. Like, it's hard for any of us.
It is. When we talk about holding both, yeah, and I think you mentioned this a moment ago, that does realistically end up looking like swinging back and forth a lot. And it depends on the day, how we're feeling about things, whether we're feeling motivated or discouraged.
Yeah. Or for me, it's even like, oh, I have this moment of worry. And then I like sit down with a student who's excited about their work on the college farm and the new pigs were just born, and then I'm like out of my head and I'm, sharing this with somebody else, this for that moment, like something positive. And so I think we're agreeing with each other.
So you mentioned the farm. I was reading about this at Warren Wilson College. So the college is supported by a working farm. On the website, it says we grow a lot of our own food right here on campus. Our farm, gardens, and forests are all tilled and harvested by student hands, and we manage them using sustainable agricultural practices. How directly involved are you in that?
The way that I'm involved in that is like I don't over there's staff with that expertise that like we have a farm manager who oversees the students and manages the crews. We call them crews that um, work all over from, moving the cows to assisting with births of sheep. I mean, it is a working farm. So the way that I'm involved in those crews is primarily not through the day-to-day work, but in my classes, I'll help students to design educational programs where we bring local school children to campus for field trips focused on themes of basically connecting to place. We do a lot of place-based learning, and there's an elementary school that's just right a couple miles down the road, and so we partner with that school quite a bit. So my role is, like, for teaching environmental education, is to to help students use the land for educational programming.
Yeah, that's something else interesting that I was reading about. So, in addition to the environmental education courses that you teach, you're involved in a lot of community engagement and other activities, the educational programs that you were just talking about for school children. Could you talk a little bit more about those community activities that you and your students are involved in?
Sure. Well, so many of our classes at Warren Wilson integrate community engagement. Not all of them, but every major, no matter what you major in, you will be engaged in service learning, community engagement through your classes at some point. And service learning or community engagement has been an integral part of Warren Wilson, long before I got here. So, we talk about these three legs of a stool, like the academics, the community engagement, and then the work on campus. And so it's an amazing place to teach environmental education, because I can, be in a classroom and then in, 3 minutes be down at the college garden. And, a lot of what I do with students is basically helping them to tap into what they are excited about. So, for example, students might be really excited about fiber arts, because we have a fiber arts crew and studio led by a talented fiber artist. So they may be really excited about that. So helping them see, okay, how can you develop, we're going to do a 2-day field trip for 100 first graders. How can you integrate that interest into, this programming that we're going to build out? So we may go to the elementary school to observe the classrooms, so they have a sense of, what's the developmental levels of, for example, first graders. And then, we'll design programming, communicate with the teachers, develop the field trips, and then the students will come, the first graders, for example, like come to Warren Wilson to the farm for a day of hands-on experiential education lessons that's connected to place, and we connect it to what they need to learn about in the standard course of study as well. So it's an amazing, way to do environmental education. So we do stuff here on the land here, but we'll also design programming for the schools on site there in their schoolyard.
And when you mentioned fiber arts, can you tell us what that is?
Sure. Well, and I'm not a fiber artist, but I work with a woman, Melanie Wilder, who is. And so, for example, just last week, actually, no, it was Monday, I took one of my classes to our fiber arts studio for a demonstration and for hands-on activities. So there's a crew of students who are working on, the art and the craft of using fiber for weaving. For example, they are taking the wool from the sheep here on campus, and then that becomes wool, and they're weaving amazing where there's tapestries or amazing artwork. And like, actually Monday I got to or was it Tuesday, I got to, like, sit at a loom and operate a loom. That was really exciting. So I'm learning, all the time, because so much of this stuff I have no idea how to do that kind of thing. And so it's fun to be learning with the students.
One of the things I was reading too is you work with students to participate in the North Carolina Environmental Education Certification Program, which I imagine is pretty valuable for students who want to become environmental educators, who want to pursue that as a career. Seems like that would be, in addition to getting their grade and their degree, that seems like that would be something valuable.
That, yeah, it's definitely valuable. And we have a strong, in North Carolina, strong professional organizations. The Environmental Educators of North Carolina is a vibrant, strong, and active organization. And so students do start that path toward the environmental ed certification. It's an extensive process. And so, they actually have a lot of things that they do as undergrads that they could contribute to that. For some of them, they start it, and then if they stay in North Carolina, and are working for an agency, then they'll often finish it up. Then I wish that we could pack it all into their time here, but that can be challenging. But it's a great program.
You may have answered this question already a moment ago when you were talking about learning with your students, but what do you love the most about your job?
That's a good question. I think what I love the most, actually, I wrote an essay about this for Business Insider that came out last week. What I think I love the most about it is that I've been able to, just by luck of falling into a place on campus. Not everybody wants to live on campus, and not everybody gets to, because there's a limited pool of these tiny little duplexes. But for me, the opportunity to raise my daughters on campus, particularly as a single parent, it gave me the flexibility that I needed. Like, if a kid was sick, I could try to find a student to, sit outside while I ran to class. It's stressful for anybody as a parent, just working and being a parent, which so many people do. But the being able to be on near my work provided a flexibility, but also it gave my daughters, this sense of a of community. The students who they had so many babysitters over the years, and for both of them, their babysitters, ended up in some ways becoming friends, as they got older. So they were mentors and friends. So I think just having other people, other older people that were different from me on this campus was, yeah. And I mean, it's a beautiful place too, for them to live in a place where they could walk anywhere. They can go down to the river and wait with friends. They can go to the cafeteria. So that a little bit more freedom than maybe other kids might have had growing up.
Hearing you describe that made me think of how, here in this country, in a lot of places, and I guess a lot of places around the world, for a long time now, it's been pretty common that, if you're an adult, a parent, you get up in the morning, you get in your car or on the subway or whatever, and you go some distance away to some office building and do your job, and then come back home at the end of the day. And there's this separation of work and home. And yet for probably very, very long time in human history, there was more of this community where you're living and working in this same place with these same group of people, and children are growing up in that environment, that much more connected environment, maybe more closely connected to the work that their parents are doing, seeing that more connected to the other people around them. And it sounds like your experience living and raising your children on this college campus was more in line with that than maybe what we think of as a modern experience. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think it does. And I've got colleagues who say, I would never work and live at the same place, like they want some separation. I mean, when I'm washing dishes, I can see a dorm, like, but I look out the other window and I see the farm and views of the mountains. So I just have to depend on which way I'm turning, east or west. Yeah, but I definitely think that that's correct. And I mean, the other kind of reality too, that wasn't as big of a thing or a constraint when I got here 24 years ago as it is now, is the housing prices in the Asheville area have are, have increased astronomically. And so the other thing that on-campus housing has allowed me to do is to live on one salary because it is a little bit cheaper rent, and that's not available for, we don't have enough housing for all staff and faculty. When I started, it was basically for the convenience and the rent, but I've stayed because I've liked that community, and the financial reality is very real as well. But I like having students over to my house. I mean, even with COVID, I used to have students inside the house, and then with COVID, I would just like meet in the front yard, with crazy creeks, because there's something that happens when you get out of the classroom that, I feel different in a way, and they, to have them to my house where it's like, okay, look, I'm somebody that cares about your future, and whether you're in the classroom or whether you're in my house, like I want you to see that this is, yeah, it's a full picture.
If there's a young professor listening to this who wants to follow in your footsteps, maybe they're teaching somewhere where there's not a really robust environmental education program, or their students don't have some of the opportunities that students have at Warren Wilson, and they want to create something like that or build something like that or work towards that. What advice would you have for someone who wants to create the kind of environment, the kind of education environment that you have at Warren Wilson?
Well, I think, I have colleagues at like UNC Asheville, for example, which is different in that they don't have the land or the work program. But I think the easiest way, from my mind, is to make these connections is through community engagement in classes. And I mean, that is where it used to be is, more unique. Now that is prevalent across higher ed, I think, where professors are designing projects that integrate the class content with concrete needs from community organizations, and that's being done, across the country. I think this is really, it's a challenging time right now, particularly for small colleges and universities, just in terms of the financial picture, in terms of the demographics. They talk about the demographic cliff, like there are fewer 18 to 22-year-olds coming through the pipeline, and higher ed is feeling that squeeze. So those two things are both real at the same time. It's exciting doing the community engagement, and it's an interesting time, to be in higher ed. I mean, here, even not just small liberal arts colleges, but UNC Asheville, UNC Greensboro has just announced cuts. If you're not one of the bigger schools that has significant research dollars coming in, it's a challenging time. I mean, the nice thing is, it's not the nice thing, but the reality is that doing some of this community engaged work typically does not take a lot of resources, but the impact on students, I think, is it's what they remember.
Sounds like that's an interesting opportunity in environmental education and in other education areas too, where it's like a win-win, where you have an opportunity for the students to learn, you're serving the community, and also that seems like that would be something that a college or university would look favorably on, to be able to say that our students and our faculty is serving the community in that way. So it seems like there's a lot of opportunity if you can pull something like that together.
Yeah, and it can be small. I mean, I think like a lot of the community engagement projects that I do, I mean, they're not going to change the world, like 2 days of field trips is to a farm, at Warren Wilson. Is that going to like change the trajectory of, a first grader's life? No, but the reality with the long history of these community partners. I mean, a really fun thing that happened several years ago, pre-COVID, was Warren Wilson in my classes partnered with high school, community high school that serves as an alternative high school for kids who need smaller class sizes for a variety of reasons. And then the local elementary school. And so we had this three school partnership that went on for, I don't know, 15 years. And I had at one point a high schooler who we were mentoring and working with to co-teach cooking and gardening lessons with the first graders. And he at the time said, "Oh, I was a first grader in this program, years and years ago." So he had been a first grader when we did this, and then he was a high schooler teaching the first graders. So, to me, the impact is often these longer term partnerships between institutions, where we see this, for me at least, kind of this institutional impact of relationship building.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, I think that's a really important message is it's okay to start small. You don't have to solve all of the problems of the world with this one project. But at the same time, you never know that like what you were describing, that field trip, that trip to a farm that a first grader takes could have a huge impact, at least on that person's life, right? And the trajectory of their life and a really positive impact. So it's sometimes we never know the impact that we're going to have, and really interesting opportunities when you realize that small efforts, relatively small, we'll say, could have a big impact, at least for individuals.
Right. And, for the college student side of things, I've definitely had students who, went on to, maybe they did this project with three schools and they were, had a lot of organizing, logistics, and program development. And then in just sharing that story in a job interview, they got a specific job because it was that skill set that could be transferable. So yeah, definitely. I'm all about what's the next right thing we can do. Because otherwise it's just, yeah, it gets overwhelming. And even now it's funny because I did this book about sustainable end of life planning. And then 2 years later, I published this book, Love Your Mother, about women in climate action. And I'm now like looking at, okay, what's my next project going to be in terms of like a book? And when I just like sit in my room and like agonize about it, it's really paralyzing. And it's like this, it's a gift to be able to write and to want to practice writing more and to have another book. But it's even that empty space can feel so paralyzing. Whereas like just doing the next right thing is energizing, So I think just doing the next right thing is can be freeing in many ways. But I'm saying that to myself as advice.
That might be a bit of a segue into a question that I like to ask people at the end of these episodes. And I'd like to ask you that same question right now. What is your dream right now?
Oh my gosh. That's so good. I'll ask that to my students because that's it's a great question. So my dream right now, there's like multiple scales, right? Like, I mean, most of my life is on a pretty small scale of like a little household. And that's like I'm in charge of that household. So a lot of my dreams are focused on my kids, for them to be healthy and to be doing something that's meaningful for them. So one little small scale dream is that my younger daughter like transitions to wants to go to UNCG in the fall, and that she makes that transition. And that feels like a very small goal, but that's a big part of being a parent, is being present during transitions, but not too present, right? So my dream on a household level is to kind of see my children through their next transitions. And, my larger kind of professional dream, I guess, is, I would like to find a way to write about this model here and life here in a way that has meaning for other people who don't live on a college campus. Like I'd like to figure out what is the story that this place might have for other people that they say as a writer, like write something that only you could write. And this is something that I could write, but I haven't yet figured out like, what's the bigger meaning and how is that relatable? And that's a very like my dream is just like professionally, I'd like to keep figuring out how to write about the intersection of ordinary life with climate in a way that has meaning for other people. So those are just my personal goals. I could say world peace and the climate neutrality, all around or climate positive future. But I think for me, like in my little world, being present for my daughters and their transitions and figuring out, how can I continue to write as through the lens that of my one little life here in a way that has greater meaning for others.
Those are great dreams.
Thanks for making me say them because instead I'm like, I tend to agonize, but that's just, we are who we are, right? I guess. And we can continue to work on those things, I guess, too.
Yeah, definitely. Mallory, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been a really great conversation. It's been really interesting to listen to. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really fun to just have the conversation and to reflect. And I'll be asking my students some of the questions that you asked me. So I appreciate it.
I've been reading one of Mallory's books, which is titled Love Your Mother, 50 States, 50 Stories, and 50 Women United for Climate Justice. It's a really cool book made up of 50 very short chapters profiling 50 different women who are working on issues related to climate justice. You can pick up the book, read a couple of these chapters, and learn a little bit about the lives of these women and the important work they're doing. So I'm looking forward to finishing it and also reading another one of Mallory's books titled Our Last Best Act, Planning for the End of Our Lives to Protect the People and Places We Love. We might even have Mallory back on the show sometime to talk about that book and how people planning for the end of their lives can do so in an environmentally responsible way. Mallory's website is MalloryMcDuff.com. We'll include that link in the show notes along with links to information about these books I just mentioned and some of the articles that she's written. I want to take a moment and say thank you to you, our listeners. You might have noticed that we haven't released a new episode in a while. My plan has always been to release a new episode every 2 weeks, but this podcast is a side project for me. It's really a labor of love, and it's something I do because I think it's important. And like all of us, I have to make tough decisions sometimes, and I have to put projects on hold, even if I would like to spend more time on them. So if you've listened to all of our previous episodes already and you've been thinking, what's going on? When is the next episode coming out? I will say thank you very much for your patience. If you haven't listened to all of our previous episodes, check them out. We've had some really wonderful guests on this show. I've enjoyed all of these conversations, and I think you will too. And we'll have some more intriguing guests and compelling conversations coming up very soon. So, what are the dogs doing? Spring is in full swing here in North Carolina, and that means there are rabbits all over the place. We had a little family of rabbits romping around in our backyard one afternoon about a week ago, including some adorable tiny baby bunnies. And of course, the dogs are fascinated by the rabbits. Is there a bunny? Bunny? That's it, folks. Thanks for listening. I am aiming to be back with another episode in 2 weeks. So until then, take care.